I am Howard, 69 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire with my bare hands just to watch my only son try to steal it. Last Tuesday, I opened my mail expecting a late invitation to his wedding. Instead, a heavy gold-embossed envelope contained an itemized bill for $290,000 to pay for his luxury seaside venue and European honeymoon. A little handwritten note was clipped to the front. "You are banned from the ceremony due to your lack of refinement, but be thankful I am letting you contribute." I did not scream. I did not break anything. I just smiled, picked up my phone, and turned his perfect high society dream into a living nightmare. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not inherited. I stood in the quiet solitude of my kitchen, the morning sun casting long shadows across the scarred wooden table. The gold foil of the heavy envelope felt unnatural against my rough, calloused fingers. For 40 years, I had built a regional construction and logistics empire from the ground up. I knew the price of sweat, the weight of concrete, and the value of a dollar earned through 70-hour work weeks. My son Tyler knew none of these things. He grew up shielded by my wealth, ultimately despising the dirt under my fingernails, preferring the hollow illusion of aristocratic high society. I tore open the flap, expecting the wedding invitation to finally arrive. Instead, a thick itemized invoice slid onto the counter. I stared at the staggering numbers. $80,000 for imported catering. $60,000 for rare floral arrangements. A first-class tour through Europe for the honeymoon. The total read $290,000. But it was the handwritten note attached to the front that truly laid bare the rot in my son's soul. He wrote that my presence would ruin the aesthetic of his new elite family, explicitly banning me due to my lack of refinement. Yet he cheekily demanded I pay the bill, telling me to be thankful I was allowed to contribute to his new standard of living. I did not react with explosive anger. Anger is a weapon for the powerless, and I was far from powerless. I placed the insulting bill flat on the table, picked up my phone, and dialed the direct unlisted line to my private wealth manager. I bypassed the standard reception entirely. The senior partner answered on the second ring, his tone entirely stripped of the usual pleasantries. He informed me with urgent precision that Tyler had just submitted a fraudulent request to liquidate $50,000 from a restricted family trust barely an hour ago. The audacity of the move demanded an immediate absolute response. I instructed my manager to execute a total freeze on every single financial account, credit line, and trust linked to my son. Less than 2 hours later, the heavy oak front door of my house flew open with a violent crash. Tyler stormed into the hallway, his face flushed with unbridled rage, the veins pulsing in his neck. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than the first work truck I ever owned. He marched into the kitchen and hurled a platinum credit card onto the counter. He had been standing inside a high-end jeweler, attempting to purchase an extravagant diamond piece for his fiancée Vanessa, when the card was publicly declined in front of the store's elite clientele. He hurled insults at my simple flannel shirt and faded jeans, demanding the immediate removal of whatever banking restriction was holding up his money. He screamed that he could not look like a destitute peasant in front of Vanessa's parents, a family he constantly praised as high society royalty. The stark contrast between my quiet, grounded silence and his superficial, frantic panic highlighted a profound disconnect. I realized in that moment that my past generosity had birthed an entitled monster. I quietly lifted my mug and took a slow sip of my black coffee. Looking him dead in the eye, I stated with absolute calm that the bank was simply conducting a routine security audit for unauthorized transactions. My total lack of intimidation pushed him over the edge. Driven by a desperate need for immediate cash to maintain his fragile facade, Tyler leaned over the table, his eyes wide with malice. He threatened to file a legal petition the very next morning to declare me mentally incompetent. He promised to lock me in a state-run facility and take control of my entire estate by force. Without waiting for my response, he stormed out of the house to seek out unscrupulous lawyers. The following morning, I sat in the sterile glass-walled office of my private attorney, Gideon Cross. The panoramic view of the city below offered no distraction from the grim reality sitting on the mahogany desk between us. Gideon placed a heavily stamped document in front of me. It was a formal power of attorney, bearing a signature that looked exactly like mine. It was forged with chilling accuracy. Tyler had submitted this fraudulent document to a major commercial bank, attempting to leverage my primary logistics warehouses as collateral for a massive high-interest loan to fund his wedding and lifestyle. I stared at the forged ink, a heavy wave of realization washing over me. Following the tragic passing of my wife years ago, the crushing grief had caused me to overcompensate. I had funded Tyler's lavish lifestyle to fill the void she left, hoping money would somehow preserve our fractured family. I recognized now that my continued silence had directly enabled this ultimate betrayal. Gideon leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, and asked if I wished to alert the police immediately for the forgery. I refused. A sudden arrest was too fleeting, too easy a way out for a man who cared only about his public image. I opted for a silent, methodical adjustment to ruin Tyler completely on his own terms. I instructed Gideon to draft the legal paperwork to sever Tyler from all family trusts and disinherit him entirely. As Gideon nodded and began typing the orders, he paused, his eyes fixed on his monitor. He looked up, warning me that the situation was far worse than a simple bank loan. Tyler had already secured the luxury coastal wedding venue, and he had used my primary corporate account as a definitive, legally binding financial guarantee. The drive along the Pacific Coast Highway offered a panoramic view of the crashing waves, but my focus remained locked on the asphalt ahead. My 10-year-old heavy-duty truck rumbled with a familiar, comforting vibration beneath my hands. The steering wheel was worn smooth by years of my grip. It was a vehicle built for labor, for hauling timber and steel, a stark physical contrast to the sleek European sports cars my son Tyler insisted on leasing to project his false image. I turned off the main highway and approached the towering wrought iron gates of the Ocean View Pavilion. The estate was a sprawling monument to excess, featuring manicured hedges, marble fountains, and a private shoreline. I knew every inch of this property. 2 decades ago, my construction firm had poured the very concrete foundation this luxury venue rested upon. A young valet in a pristine white vest stepped forward as I pulled up to the main entrance. He held up a hand, clearly intending to redirect my battered truck to the service entrance in the back. I rolled down the window, ignoring his practiced smile, and told him to leave the vehicle exactly where it was. I tossed him a $20 bill and walked right past the frantic event coordinators buzzing around the lobby with clipboards and headsets. They called after me, demanding to know my business, but I did not stop or turn around. I knew exactly where I was going. I navigated the familiar grand corridors and pushed open the solid oak doors to the executive office. Oliver Banks, the owner of the estate, and a man who owed his initial business success to a substantial loan I had quietly provided him 15 years ago, looked up from his desk. His annoyance at the sudden intrusion evaporated the moment he recognized my face. All the color drained from his cheeks. He stood up so fast, his leather chair crashed into the credenza behind him. He stared at me as if a ghost had just walked through his door. He stammered my name, his eyes darting up and down my tailored suit and steady posture. He asked how I was walking, how I was speaking so clearly, and how I had managed to escape the medical facility. I pulled a chair out and sat down opposite his desk. I asked him to explain exactly what facility he was talking about. Oliver swallowed hard, lowering himself back into his seat. He opened a thick manila folder on his desk, pulling out a wedding contract bearing Tyler's signature. He explained that Tyler had sat in that very office 3 months ago, weeping openly. Tyler had told Oliver that I had suffered a catastrophic mental collapse. According to my son, I was suffering from rapid onset terminal dementia and had been permanently committed to a state-run memory care unit because I had grown violent and completely incoherent. Tyler had claimed that his medical bills for my specialized care were draining his savings, leaving him struggling to afford a proper wedding for his beautiful bride. The air in the room grew ice cold. The magnitude of the lie settled heavily on my chest. Tyler had not merely excluded me from his celebration because my working-class demeanor embarrassed him. He had legally and socially erased me. He had pronounced his father functionally dead to the entire world. Oliver looked at me with deep shame. He admitted that out of respect for our past friendship and pity for my supposed condition, he had slashed the venue rental fee by half. He also revealed something much worse. Tyler had set up a designated sympathy fund in my name. The wedding website explicitly instructed the wealthy guests to donate cash directly to the couple to help offset the tragic burden of my permanent medical confinement. My own son was actively using my fabricated mental decay to solicit pity cash from aristocratic strangers. I felt a sharp, bitter ache in my chest, reminiscent of the day I found a teenage Tyler stealing cash from my wallet to buy designer sneakers he did not need. Back then I had lectured him and replaced the money, hoping it was a childish phase. My leniency had only taught him how to scale his theft. The petty thief had evolved into a master manipulator. Oliver began to reach for his phone. He offered to cancel the entire event right then and there. He offered to call the police and report the fraud immediately. I reached across the desk and placed my hand over his. I told him to do absolutely nothing. Canceling the wedding now would allow Tyler to play the victim once again. He would spin a new lie claiming a cruel misunderstanding or a banking error and escape the true weight of his actions. A swift cancellation was far too merciful. I needed a stage and I needed an audience to witness the collapse of his illusion. I instructed Oliver to keep the reservation entirely active. However, I required one specific alteration to the seating chart. I told him to place an unlisted secure seat at the head table for the rehearsal dinner the following evening. I made it clear that my presence was to remain an absolute secret from the groom, the bride, and every single coordinator on his payroll. Oliver nodded slowly, recognizing the dangerous calm in my voice. He understood that a reckoning was coming to his venue, and he wisely chose to step out of its path. I thanked him for his time and walked out of the office. The grand lobby was now a hive of frenzied activity. Florists were arranging towering displays of imported white roses. Caterers were hauling in crates of expensive champagne. I walked toward the front entrance, invisible to the staff who assumed I was merely an inspector or a senior contractor. As I approached the glass double doors, a harsh, shrill voice echoed from the adjacent tasting room. I paused in the shadow of a marble pillar. Standing near a display of crystal glassware were Vanessa's parents. I had never formally met them, as Tyler had gone to great lengths to keep our worlds separate, but I recognized them from the photographs Tyler used to flaunt. They were dressed in impeccably tailored resort wear, exuding the kind of inherited wealth that Tyler worshipped. The mother, a woman with tight features and a severe posture, was leaning over a young waitress. She was viciously berating the girl because the sparkling water was served with a slice of standard lemon instead of the imported citrus she had explicitly requested. She called the waitress incompetent, questioning her basic intelligence, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. The father stood beside her, checking his diamond-encrusted watch and loudly complaining that this venue was barely adequate for a family of their social standing. He sneered at the staff demanding to speak to someone with actual authority. I watched the waitress blink back tears, apologizing profusely while gathering the rejected glasses. The sheer cruelty of the interaction was striking. Wealthy people certainly had high standards, but this public display felt different. It felt incredibly performative. It lacked the quiet confidence of people who actually possessed generational power. Their desperation to assert dominance over a minimum wage worker reeked of deep insecurity. I watched them march out toward the terrace, loudly complaining about the cost of the valet service. A sudden, sharp realization struck me. People who possessed the kind of vast, untouchable fortune Tyler claimed they had did not behave with such frantic arrogance over a slice of lemon. They certainly did not complain about valet fees at a wedding my son was supposedly financing through his own corporate success. The puzzle pieces began to shift in my mind. Tyler was a liar willing to declare his father dead for a venue discount and sympathy cash. What if the prestigious family he was marrying into was playing the exact same game? I walked out the front doors and approached my truck. The valet quickly handed me my keys, stepping back respectfully. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. The roar of the heavy machinery felt like a battle cry. I pulled out of the lavish estate and merged back onto the coastal highway. Tyler believed he had masterfully manipulated the board, securing his place in high society by burying me alive. He had no idea that I was no longer the forgiving father, willing to quietly pay his debts. As I drove back toward the city, I picked up my phone and dialed the number for a premier corporate investigator I had used years ago to vet rival construction firms. The rehearsal dinner was exactly 36 hours away. I had a forged power of attorney, an unpaid bill for nearly $300,000, and a son who had pronounced me dead to the world. Now I needed to know exactly who Vanessa and her aristocratic parents truly were. The time for silent observation was over. I was going to tear their pristine illusion down to the foundation, and I was going to make sure the collapse was spectacular. I did not return to my empty house to mourn the son I had lost. I returned to my office and opened my private contact ledger. During my decades in the commercial construction sector, I learned that a weak foundation will eventually collapse the tallest skyscraper. I needed to inspect the bedrock of this upcoming marriage. I dialed the direct line of a premier corporate investigator I had retained over the years to vet rival firms and corrupt developers. I gave him a single clear directive. I needed the absolute financial reality of my son, and the woman he intended to marry pulled apart down to the very last cent. For 48 hours, I maintained total silence. I walked through the quiet halls of my home, tracing my fingers over the framed photographs of a younger, innocent Tyler. My late wife had always believed our son would grow into a compassionate man. I had spent years writing checks to cover his minor indiscretions, quietly, hoping my financial support would shield him from the harshness of the world. Instead, it had insulated him from reality and bred a parasite. My grief had blinded my business instincts. Now, those instincts were wide awake. The heavy sealed dossier arrived on my porch via a private courier exactly 2 days later. I carried it to my kitchen table, poured a fresh cup of black coffee, and broke the wax seal. The first few pages detailed Tyler's catastrophic financial ruin, confirming what the declined platinum card had already suggested. But the true revelation lay in the exhaustive financial background of his future bride. Vanessa and her parents presented themselves to the world as aristocratic elites draped in designer labels and dripping with condescension. The investigator's report told a drastically different story. Their ancestral estate was currently under its third notice of foreclosure. The luxury vehicles they drove were heavily leased and months behind on payments. Their entire social standing was a hollow facade constructed on toxic debt and maxed-out credit lines. The mother who had viciously berated a young waitress over a slice of lemon at the wedding venue was actively dodging calls from aggressive collection agencies. I flipped to the next section and discovered a web of mutual, pathetic deception. Tyler had completely fabricated his standing in my company. He had convinced Vanessa and her bankrupt parents that he was the sole, uncontested owner of my entire logistics empire. In return, Vanessa had sold him the illusion of deep generational wealth. They were two drowning frauds clinging to each other, both fully believing the other was a golden lifeboat. This grand $290,000 wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a desperate, high-stakes corporate merger built on absolute lies. They were both planning to use the marriage certificate to secure a massive payout from my estate to save themselves from imminent financial ruin. A dark amusement settled over me, but it vanished entirely when I reached the final section of the dossier. The investigator had managed to access a series of deleted emails and encrypted text messages between Tyler and Vanessa. I read the printed transcripts with a chilling clarity. The financial scam was only the beginning. Tyler and Vanessa had recognized that my continued independence posed a massive threat to their access to my capital. They had formulated a concrete, sinister solution. The messages detailed a precise and terrifying timeline. The moment they returned from their lavish European honeymoon, Tyler planned to execute the forged power of attorney. They had already selected a substandard state-run psychiatric facility located 3 counties away. They mocked the dismal conditions of the place in their messages, joking about how the heavily medicated environment would keep me compliant and quiet. Tyler explicitly instructed Vanessa on how they would coordinate their testimonies to a corrupt medical examiner, legally stripping me of my human rights and locking me away permanently. They were plotting to steal my life, my freedom, and my dignity, and they planned to toast to my demise with champagne bought with my own money. I closed the heavy dossier and pressed my calloused hands flat against the wooden table. The quiet solitude of my kitchen was no longer a place of mourning. It had become a war room. My son believed he held the winning hand. He believed he was outsmarting a frail, generous old man. He had no idea he was dealing with an architect who knew exactly how to demolish a structure with a single, perfectly placed charge. The sun had barely begun to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor of my study, when I laid the final stack of paperwork out on my desk. Gideon had been thorough. The documents before me were the structural supports of my son Tyler's artificial life, and I was about to systematically pull every single pin. I picked up my heavy fountain pen, feeling the cold weight of the brass against my calloused fingers. For years, this pen had been an instrument of endless grace, writing checks to smooth over Tyler's mistakes, signing authorizations to elevate his social standing, and endorsing the lavish lifestyle he felt he was inherently owed. Today, the ink would serve a very different purpose. I pulled the first document toward me. It was the guarantor agreement for the sprawling luxury penthouse Tyler occupied in the heart of the downtown financial district. The monthly rent was an astronomical figure, a sum Tyler justified by claiming he needed to project extreme success to attract top-tier investors. In reality, he lacked the credit score and the verified income to secure a broom closet in that building on his own merit. I had quietly co-signed the master lease, hiding my involvement behind a web of corporate holding companies, so Tyler could boast about his self-made independence. I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed the formal revocation. With that single stroke of black ink, the financial shielding evaporated. I moved to the next file. It contained the comprehensive premium auto insurance policies covering the 2 European sports cars Tyler leased. He drove them with reckless arrogance, treating the speed limits and the safety of others with the same disdain he reserved for the working class. I signed the cancellation orders for both policies, effective immediately. Without my corporate umbrella policy backing those vehicles, the leasing agency would be notified of the sudden lapse in coverage within the hour. The contractual default would trigger an immediate repossession order. As I moved the documents into the outgoing courier tray, a profound silence settled over the room. It was not the oppressive silence of grief, but the sharp, ringing quiet of absolute clarity. I sat back in my leather chair and looked at my hands. They were the hands of a man who had built a kingdom from dirt and sweat. Yet they had been entirely misused in raising my only son. The memories came flooding back, uninvited, but necessary. I remembered the first time I bailed him out shortly after his mother passed away. He had totaled his first car in a reckless street race, and instead of letting him face the harsh reality of his actions, I had quietly purchased him a better model. I told myself he was grieving. I told myself he had already suffered enough loss. That single act of misguided mercy had set a disastrous precedent. Over the years, the bailouts grew larger and more frequent. There was the failed tech startup he launched with his fraternity brothers, a venture that collapsed under the weight of their excessive partying and zero actual product development. I had quietly absorbed the $250,000 loss paying off their creditors, so Tyler would not face public humiliation. There was the country club incident, the destroyed property, the bounced checks. Every time he stumbled, I rushed in to pave the road ahead of him, convinced that my financial protection was an expression of paternal love. Looking at the signed revocation forms, the bitter truth washed over me. I had not protected my son at all. I had deliberately handicapped him. I had robbed him of the fundamental human experience of facing a consequence, learning from failure, and building genuine character. True love, the kind of love a father owes his son, requires unyielding boundaries, not endless cowardly bailouts. I had engineered a parasite, a man utterly dependent on my labor, while simultaneously despising the very hands that fed him. I felt a deep, agonizing pang of regret for my own complicity in his creation. But that regret rapidly hardened into cold, unbreakable resolve. The time for enablement was over. The surgical removal of his safety nets was the only cure left. I picked up my phone and dialed the property management group that oversaw the downtown penthouse. I bypassed the standard leasing agents and spoke directly to the regional director, a woman who knew exactly who I was and the magnitude of the accounts I controlled. I informed her, in a voice entirely devoid of emotion, that my corporate holding company was formally withdrawing as the guarantor for Tyler's residence, citing a discovery of fraudulent financial misrepresentation on the part of the tenant. The regional director audibly gasped. The building had strict, uncompromising policies regarding financial backing. She informed me that without my corporate guarantee, Tyler's personal debt-to-income ratio would immediately flag the account as a critical liability. The lease explicitly stated that any lapse in guarantor status or discovery of financial misrepresentation resulted in an automatic, non-negotiable termination of the residency. I confirmed that I understood the terms perfectly. I told her I expected the management group to follow their standard eviction protocols without an ounce of hesitation or leniency. She assured me the legal notice would be generated and served before the evening was over. Across the city, Tyler was completely oblivious to the financial guillotine falling toward his neck. According to the itinerary I had extracted from his pretentious wedding website, he and Vanessa were hosting an intimate high-society cocktail hour at the penthouse that very evening. It was designed to be a lavish display of their impending union, a chance for Vanessa's parents to inspect the luxurious nest their daughter was marrying into. Tyler had spared no expense hiring a private mixologist and a string quartet, charging it all to credit lines that were currently freezing over one by one. I pictured the scene unfolding with the precision of a ticking clock. Tyler would be standing in the grand foyer of his penthouse, wearing a velvet smoking jacket, admiring his own reflection in the mirrored walls. He would be anxiously checking his phone, wondering why his secondary credit cards were suddenly declining the catering charges, blindly assuming it was a temporary banking glitch. He would pace across the imported marble floors, rehearsing the arrogant, boastful anecdotes he planned to feed his future in-laws desperate to validate the illusion of his limitless wealth. Down in the lobby of the building, the property manager was printing a brightly colored, legally binding document. It was a 24-hour notice to vacate the premises. The language on the paper was cold, absolute, and unforgiving. It detailed the immediate termination of the lease due to fraudulent financial backing and the total withdrawal of the guarantor. The manager marched into the private elevator clutching the notice and a roll of heavy-duty tape. The timing of the universe often favors those who finally choose to administer justice. As the private elevator ascended the glass tower, a sleek town car pulled up to the valet stand outside. Vanessa's parents emerged draped in designer clothing, their faces locked in their usual expressions of haughty judgment. They walked into the building demanding immediate access to the penthouse floor, entirely unaware that the man they were about to visit was now functionally homeless. The property manager stepped off the elevator and walked swiftly down the quiet carpeted hallway. He reached Tyler's heavy double doors. Inside, the muffled sound of the string quartet playing a classical arrangement drifted into the hall. The manager did not knock. He did not ask for a private conversation. He simply slapped the vibrant, humiliating eviction notice directly onto the center of the dark wood door, securing it with thick strips of tape, ensuring it was impossible to miss. Just as the manager turned to walk toward the service elevator, the chime of the main private elevator echoed through the hall. The polished metal doors slid open. Vanessa's parents stepped out, adjusting their expensive coats, preparing to make a grand entrance. They stopped dead in their tracks. Tyler, hearing the chime of the elevator, pulled open his front doors, with a wide, practiced smile, a crystal glass of champagne in his hand. He stepped forward to welcome his aristocratic guests. Instead of returning his greeting, Vanessa's mother and father stood frozen in the hallway, their eyes locked, not on Tyler, but on the glaring, brightly colored legal document plastered directly at eye level on his door. The words, "Notice of Eviction and Fraudulent Misrepresentation," were printed in bold, unavoidable black ink. The flawless illusion of my son's elite empire shattered into a million jagged pieces right there in the hallway. And the long, painful fall back to reality had officially begun. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my study, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the dark room. My investigator had provided me with a secure link to the audio and visual feeds from the hallway security cameras of Tyler's luxury building. He had also managed to clone the incoming audio of my son's mobile device. I watched the live feed with the detached precision of a surgeon observing a fascinating but terminal disease. The heavy wooden door of the penthouse filled the camera frame. Right in the center of that polished mahogany surface was the vibrant, unmistakable notice of eviction. The private elevator chimed softly through the audio feed. The polished metal doors parted smoothly. Vanessa's parents stepped into the hallway. They wore their usual expressions of manufactured superiority. The father adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, while the mother cast a critical eye over the hallway decor. Then their eyes locked onto the brightly colored legal document taped to the door. Their practiced aristocratic smiles vanished instantly. The mother leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she read the bold black letters declaring a fraudulent misrepresentation of finances. Just as the father reached out to peel the notice from the wood, the door swung open from the inside. Tyler stood there holding a crystal champagne flute. He had dressed in a velvet smoking jacket, playing the part of the wealthy young heir to absolute perfection. His welcoming smile froze the moment he saw where their eyes were fixed. Through the camera feed, I watched all the blood drained from my son's face. The genuine, unadulterated panic that washed over him was something I had not seen in years. Tyler lunged forward and ripped the paper from the door with a violent tearing sound. He crumpled the thick legal notice in his fist, shoving it deep into his pocket. He forced a loud synthetic laugh that echoed awkwardly down the long corridor. He immediately launched into a frantic, desperate lie. He told Vanessa's parents that it was nothing but a laughable clerical error. He blamed the accounting department of my construction firm. He called my employees incompetent subordinates who had mixed up the routing numbers for his personal lease. He swore he would have the entire management office fired by Monday morning for the insult. Vanessa's parents exchanged a slow, calculating look. They were grifters themselves, desperately hiding their own impending bankruptcy, which meant they possessed a keen instinct for recognizing another fraud. However, they were too heavily invested in the illusion of my wealth to challenge him right there in the hallway. The father forced a tight smile, patted Tyler on the shoulder, and told him that good help was simply impossible to find these days. They stepped past him into the lavish penthouse, leaving Tyler alone in the doorway for a brief moment. He leaned his forehead against the doorframe, gasping for air like a drowning man. He excused himself a few minutes later, slipping back out into the hallway and pulling the heavy door shut behind him. He needed absolute privacy. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket with shaking hands. Sitting in my study across the city, I watched him pace back and forth in front of the camera. Then my own personal phone began to ring. It was Tyler. I did not answer. I simply watched the screen and let the call divert to my automated voicemail system. Tyler pressed the phone to his ear. I listened to the audio feed as he navigated the sterile greeting of my voicemail. He left a frantic, threatening message first. He demanded that I call the bank immediately and fix the hold on his accounts. He screamed into the receiver, threatening to call the authorities and declare me mentally unfit if I ruined his evening. He hung up and immediately called back. The second voicemail was less aggressive and more pleading. He begged me to pick up the phone, claiming there was a massive misunderstanding and that he needed my help to save face in front of his future in-laws. By the fourth call, he was openly weeping, begging his father to fix his life. Watching him pace the corridor sweating through his expensive velvet jacket brought back a flood of sharp memories. His frantic pacing mirrored a very specific childhood habit. When Tyler was 12 years old, he had been suspended from a prestigious private academy for stealing answers to a final exam. He had intercepted the disciplinary letter in the mail and hid it under his mattress. He paced his bedroom floor for days, terrified of the impending fallout. When the school finally called me directly, Tyler had employed this exact same strategy. He lied frantically. He blamed the teacher. He wept and begged for me to clean up the mess. And to my eternal regret, I had driven to the school, made a massive donation to the new library fund, and made the problem disappear. Tyler had never faced a true consequence in his entire life. He had spent 30 years relying on my wealth and my misplaced guilt to shield him from the reality of his own actions. He was acting exactly like that 12-year-old boy right now, fully expecting his father to swoop in and write a check to banish the monsters at the door. But the father he relied on no longer existed. Realizing that my phone was permanently silenced, Tyler was backed into a terrifying corner. The venue needed nearly $300,000 by midnight. The penthouse management wanted him out by tomorrow. His future in-laws were sitting 20 feet away, drinking champagne he could no longer afford. The desperation pushed him to make a catastrophic decision. I watched him punch a new unlisted number into his keypad. The audio feed picked up the ringing tone, followed by the gruff voice of an underground loan shark. This was a man operating far outside the bounds of legal banking, the kind of predator who dealt in extortionate interest rates and physical threats. Tyler kept his voice to a frantic whisper, begging the man for an immediate bridge loan to cover the wedding venue and the penthouse arrears. As Tyler pleaded with the criminal on the phone, the heavy wooden door of the penthouse cracked open just an inch. Vanessa's father stepped quietly into the gap. Perhaps he had been looking for the restroom or seeking a quiet place to take a business call of his own. Instead, he found himself standing in the shadows, perfectly positioned to eavesdrop on his future son-in-law. Through the hidden camera, I watched the older man hold his breath, pressing his ear closer to the narrow opening. He listened intently as Tyler made his desperate pitch. Tyler promised the loan shark a massive exponential payout the very morning after the wedding ceremony. The loan shark demanded to know what kind of collateral a man with frozen bank accounts could possibly offer. Tyler did not hesitate. He explicitly named my primary commercial warehouses and the entire fleet of my logistics vehicles as illegal collateral. He promised the lender that he was executing a medical power of attorney over his father. He swore that by Monday morning, he would have full, uncontested legal control of my entire multi-million-dollar estate. Vanessa's father stood perfectly still behind the cracked door. The audio feed caught the sharp intake of his breath. The pieces of the puzzle were slamming together in the older man's mind. The declined credit cards, the sudden eviction notice on the door, the frantic pacing in the hallway. Tyler was not a billionaire heir in control of a vast empire. He was a desperate broke fraud trying to steal his father's company out from under him. Suspicion took deep, immovable root in the mind of Vanessa's father. He realized that the golden goose his family was planning to slaughter was currently bleeding out in the hallway. If Tyler did not actually control the money, then Vanessa's family was merging their bankrupt estate with another sinking ship. The mutual scam they had all carefully constructed was beginning to fracture violently from within. The father silently pulled the door shut, slipping back into the party to warn his wife. Outside in the hallway, Tyler hung up the phone, believing he had just bought himself a few more hours of survival. He adjusted his velvet jacket, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and prepared to walk back inside to face the wolves he had invited to his own slaughter. Tyler stood trembling in the carpeted hallway of the luxury building. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal desperate for escape. The velvet smoking jacket he wore suddenly felt suffocating. It felt like a heavy shroud rather than a symbol of elite status. He had just finished pleading with a dangerous criminal. He had literally bargained his father's hard-earned empire away for a few more hours of fake aristocracy. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and took a deep breath. He tried to prepare himself to step back into the penthouse to face his future in-laws. Before his hand could even touch the polished brass handle of the front door, his mobile phone vibrated violently against his thigh. He pulled the device from his pocket. He fully expected the loan shark calling back to demand more collateral. Instead, the bright screen flashed a pristine coastal area code. It was the executive director of the Ocean View Pavilion. Tyler swallowed hard and answered the call. He forced a tone of casual authority into his voice. The venue director did not reciprocate the forced warmth. His voice was entirely devoid of the sycophantic reverence Tyler had grown accustomed to over the past 6 months of planning. The director spoke with a cold and clinical precision. He informed Tyler that the accounting department had just flagged a massive and critical discrepancy in their files. The corporate financial guarantee originally backing the wedding contract had been officially and permanently revoked by the primary account holder just moments ago. The director stated with absolute finality that the venue required immediate compensation. Unless a direct wire transfer of $290,000 cleared their accounts. By midnight, the grand iron gates of the coastal estate would remain permanently locked. There would be no rare floral arrangements. There would be no imported champagne. There would be no ceremony of any kind. The event would be completely scrubbed from their prestigious calendar, and private security would turn away any arriving guests. Tyler felt the warm blood drain entirely from his face. His skin turned cold and clammy under the harsh hallway lighting. He desperately tried to project power to regain control of the narrative. He raised his voice and barked hollow threats about breach of contract. He threatened to ruin the venue's pristine reputation in high society circles. He promised to unleash a fleet of corporate lawyers to sue them into absolute oblivion. The director simply remained silent on the other end of the line. He allowed Tyler's panicked bluster to echo uselessly. When Tyler finally ran out of breath and the silence grew heavy, the director calmly reiterated the strict midnight deadline and ended the call. The dial tone hummed in Tyler's ear. It sounded like a digital death knell for his entire carefully constructed life. He was backed into a dark corner with the walls closing in rapidly. Panic stripped away his refined facade. It left only a desperate and terrified man standing alone in a silent corridor. He leaned heavily against the hallway wall. He pulled his sleek leather wallet from his inner pocket. His fingers fumbled past a row of useless and deactivated platinum credit cards. He dug deep into the hidden back slot until he found a stark black plastic square. It was a secondary corporate expense card belonging directly to his father. Howard had issued the card to him 5 years ago during a brief and disastrous period where Tyler had attempted to work as an executive vice president at the construction firm. Tyler had kept the card hidden long after he abandoned the demanding job. He had always viewed it as a secret financial parachute. He told himself he would only pull that cord in a life-or-death emergency. Tonight was that ultimate emergency. Tyler quickly dialed the automated payment system for the coastal venue. His hands were shaking so severely that he nearly dropped the phone. He punched in the 16-digit card number along with the expiration date and the security code. He formally authorized the transfer for the full $290,000. He held his breath. He listened to the automated voice ask him to wait while the massive transaction was processed. A heavy and oppressive silence stretched over the cellular connection. Tyler closed his eyes. He silently prayed to a God he routinely ignored for a miracle he absolutely did not deserve. The system then returned a harsh and unyielding tone. The transaction was instantly declined. A severe fraud alert had been triggered within the banking network. Before Tyler could even attempt to run the numbers a second time, an automated security protocol initiated a global freeze on the card. The system permanently locked the account due to unauthorized access. The digital voice flatly informed him that local authorities would be notified of the fraudulent attempt. Tyler hurled the phone against the hallway wall. The screen shattered into a spider web of cracked glass upon impact. He slid down the expensive wallpaper, pulling his knees tightly to his chest. The crushing reality of his complete powerlessness crashed down upon his shoulders. Sitting on the floor of the hallway, totally stripped of his father's financial shield, Tyler was forced to confront the terrifying emptiness of his own existence. His entire identity was built exclusively on Howard's stellar reputation. The name Blake commanded immense respect in this city, only because of the thick calluses on his father's hands. That respect came from decades of relentless physical labor and an empire forged in raw steel and poured concrete. Tyler had spent his entire adult life mocking that honest labor. He preferred playing the part of a refined aristocrat. He was entirely convinced that his own inherent brilliance sustained his lavish lifestyle. Now he was facing imminent exposure before the wealthy peers he so desperately sought to impress. He realized with sickening clarity that he was nothing but a fragile parasite. Without Howard's vast sums of money, he possessed no real power. He had no genuine influence and absolutely no future. The thought of walking back into that penthouse filled him with paralyzing dread. Admitting to Vanessa's haughty parents that he was a broke and fraudulent failure terrified him far more than the concept of physical death. His frantic pacing and profuse sweating mirrored a very specific childhood habit. Whenever he received disciplinary letters from his private school, he would hide them and pace his room in sheer terror. He had never faced a true consequence in his entire life. He had always relied on Howard to step in and write a blank check to clean up the mess. Howard was gone now, supposedly locked away in a memory care unit by Tyler's own sinister design, leaving him entirely exposed to the world. The digital clock on his shattered phone screen glowed brightly from the hallway carpet. It read 9 o'clock in the evening. He had exactly 3 hours before the venue locked their gates forever. That lockout would effectively cancel the wedding and expose his total bankruptcy to the entire city. The underground loan shark was a dead end without tangible collateral. The corporate bank accounts were a fortified fortress he could no longer penetrate. He needed physical and untraceable assets. He needed them immediately to salvage his crumbling world. A reckless and highly criminal plan began to take shape in his desperate mind. He remembered the heavy steel wall safe hidden carefully behind the oak bookshelf in his father's private home office. He knew that Howard despised digital banking for long-term wealth preservation. His father always preferred the tangible security of physical assets. Tyler knew for a fact that the heavy safe held millions in unregistered bearer bonds, solid gold reserves, and vintage stock certificates. If he could manage to breach that safe tonight, he could easily pay the venue manager in untraceable cash. He could then hand the remaining bearer bonds to the loan shark to buy his permanent silence and keep his dangerous new creditors at bay. The plan required breaking into his father's house under the strict cover of darkness. It required committing grand larceny against his own blood. Pushed to the absolute brink of societal ruin, Tyler made his final choice. He decided that crossing the line into outright criminality was entirely preferable to facing the deep humiliation of public poverty. He slowly stood up from the hallway floor. He carefully brushed the invisible lint from his velvet smoking jacket. His eyes grew wide with a dangerous and frenzied resolve. He would leave the cocktail party through the service elevator. He would secure his future by stealing the very foundation his father had spent a lifetime building. The midnight air hung thick and silent around my property. I sat alone in the unlit kitchen, the only illumination coming from the soft blue glow of the security monitor resting on the granite counter. A cup of coffee, long gone cold, sat untouched beside my hand. I had anticipated this move. Desperation is a predictable architect, and my son was rapidly running out of materials to build his lies. 2 days ago, I had contracted a top-tier security firm to completely rewire the perimeter and interior of the estate. They installed motion sensors, silent alarms, and high-definition infrared cameras in every critical room. Tyler believed he was sneaking into the vulnerable home of a defenseless, dementia-ridden old man. He was walking directly into an observation deck. At exactly 10 minutes past midnight, the perimeter alert flashed silently on my screen. A dark figure slipped over the wrought iron side gate, avoiding the main driveway entirely. The camera feed tracked him perfectly. It was Tyler. He was still wearing the trousers and dress shirt from his rehearsal dinner. though the velvet jacket was gone, replaced by a dark windbreaker. He moved with a frantic, jittery energy, entirely lacking the smooth confidence he projected in downtown penthouses. I watched as he approached the side entrance, the door leading directly into the mudroom. He reached for the keypad, confidently punching in the 5-digit code he had known since childhood. He did not know that the new system allowed the old code to grant access while simultaneously capturing his exact entry time and location. The door clicked open, and the prodigal son stepped inside. I watched him navigate the dark hallways with the aid of a small flashlight. He moved swiftly past the living room and headed straight for the west wing of the house. He was heading for my private study. This was the room where the foundation of the Blake Empire had been drafted. It was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and worn leather filled with architectural blueprints, framed photographs of my late wife, and the quiet history of a lifetime of labor. The camera feed inside the study flared to life as Tyler pushed the door open. He did not bother to search delicately. He moved like a desperate scavenger. I watched through the high-definition lens as he began to physically tear my sanctuary apart. He yanked open the drawers of my antique desk, dumping files and personal letters onto the floor. He swept a row of framed family photographs off the credenza, the glass shattering against the hardwood. He was looking for loose cash, spare checkbooks, anything he could use to stop the bleeding of his ruined life. Watching him desecrate the room where his mother and I used to sit by the fire brought a profound, heavy silence to my heart. Any lingering shred of paternal hesitation, any foolish hope that my son could be reasoned with or saved by compassion, died in that moment. I felt the final fragments of my guilt evaporate. He was not a misguided child making a poor financial decision. He was a predator willing to destroy the very history of his family to save his own skin. The physical violation of my home solidified my resolve into something resembling cold iron. The time for sorrow had passed. Only a demand for absolute justice remained. Tyler finally abandoned the desk and moved toward the massive oak bookshelf lining the far wall. I watched his flashlight beam tremble as he grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden structure. He pulled hard, sliding the custom-built shelf to the left on its hidden tracks. The movement revealed the large, heavy steel wall safe embedded deep into the reinforced concrete. This was the vault he believed held his salvation. For years he had known that I kept untraceable assets in that safe. Bearer bonds, vintage stock certificates, and solid gold reserves. He believed those assets were sitting there waiting to be stolen and handed over to an underground loan shark to buy his freedom. He dropped to his knees in front of the steel door. The camera angle provided a flawless view of his face. Sweat poured down his temples, matting his hair to his forehead. He reached for the mechanical dial. He spun the metal wheel with frantic precision, inputting the combination he had secretly memorized years ago when he thought I was not looking. The heavy internal tumblers clicked into place one by one. The sound was loud in the empty house, echoing through the silent halls. Tyler gripped the handle, his chest heaving with desperate anticipation. He threw his weight backward, pulling the heavy steel door wide open. He immediately thrust his flashlight into the dark cavity, lunging forward to grab the millions in unregistered wealth he believed would solve all his problems. The vault was completely empty. There were no stacks of bonds. There were no stock certificates. There was no gold. I had emptied the entire safe 48 hours prior, transferring every tangible asset to a secure depository entirely outside his reach. The only thing sitting in the center of the cavernous steel box was a single crisp white envelope. Through the infrared camera, I watched Tyler freeze. His entire body went rigid as the beam of his flashlight illuminated the pristine paper. He reached a shaking hand into the empty vault and pulled the envelope out. He tore the flap open with clumsy, terrified fingers. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock. I had written the message myself using the very fountain pen I had once used to sign his tuition checks. Tyler held the paper up to the light. The camera captured the exact moment his eyes moved across the handwritten words. "Thieves find no shelter here, shelter." He dropped the paper as if it had caught fire. He stumbled backward, his back slamming hard against the oak bookshelf. The desperate, greedy scavenger vanished instantly, replaced by a hunted animal. He looked wildly around the darkened study. The realization hit him with a sudden, paralyzing clarity. The empty safe, the declined credit cards, the sudden eviction notice. The perfectly coordinated destruction of his financial life was not a series of unfortunate administrative errors. It was an execution. His father was not locked away in a dementia ward lost in a fog of mental decay. His father knew absolutely everything, and his father was awake. Tyler realized he was standing in the middle of a trap that had already snapped shut, and he had blindly locked himself inside. I sat in the darkness of my kitchen watching him scramble wildly toward the door, and I allowed myself a single quiet breath of satisfaction. The foundation of his lies had crumbled, and the roof was finally caving in. The grand ballroom of the coastal estate was a masterpiece of absolute architectural arrogance. High vaulted ceilings stretched upward toward a series of massive crystal chandeliers. The light from 1,000-faceted glass teardrops rained down upon the polished marble floor. It was an environment deliberately engineered to intimidate anyone who crossed its threshold. The estate was perched high on the rocky cliffs overlooking the churning dark waters of the ocean. The faint sound of the crashing waves occasionally bled through the thick glass windows, providing a rhythmic, ominous percussion to the evening's events. Every surface in the room gleamed with polished silver and flawless glass. Down the center of the impossibly long dining tables ran rivers of imported white orchids and rare lilies. These exotic floral arrangements had been flown in at a staggering cost. They were supposed to represent the blossoming union of two powerful dynasties. Instead, they stood as a grotesque monument to a colossal lie. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating perfume of the dying flowers and the expensive colognes of the city elite. It was an atmosphere of pure pretense. White-coated waiters circulated silently with silver trays of caviar and rare truffles, completely oblivious to the fact that their wages would never actually be paid. This entire extravagant rehearsal dinner was nothing more than a lavish stage play performed by actors who could not afford their own costumes. The sheer scale of the wealth on display only highlighted the grotesque absurdity of the situation. Every bite of food, every sip of wine, every note played by the string quartet was secured by fraudulent promises and rapidly expiring time. Tyler stood near the head of the main table, completely drowning in his own bespoke tuxedo. The heavy, expensive fabric clung to his skin, soaked through with a cold, relentless sweat. His crisp white collar felt like a hangman's noose slowly tightening around his throat. He held a bottle of vintage champagne in his right hand. The green glass was slick with the condensation of his own panicked perspiration. He attempted to pour the sparkling golden liquid into the crystal flutes of his nearby guests, but his hands betrayed him with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The crystal clinked sharply against the neck of the bottle, a jarring, clumsy sound that pierced the elegant murmur of the room. Tyler forced his lips into a wide, agonizing smile. He nodded enthusiastically at the empty compliments of the local socialites. He laughed at jokes he did not hear. Internally, he was collapsing into a dark, bottomless void. His mind was trapped in the terrifying loop of the previous night. He kept seeing the gaping black maw of his father's empty wall safe. He kept reading the words written in that crisp, familiar handwriting. Thieves find no shelter here. The trap had been expertly sprung, and Tyler was quietly bleeding out on the ballroom floor while smiling for the cameras. He knew, with absolute sickening certainty, that the venue director was waiting in an office just down the hall. The midnight deadline for the final $250,000 payment was approaching with the speed of an oncoming train. Without his father's corporate financial umbrella, Tyler was functionally destitute. He had absolutely zero leverage. He possessed zero actual capital. He was a hollow vessel constructed entirely from Howard's reputation and Howard's bank accounts. Stripped of that impenetrable armor, he was exposed as a complete fraud before the exact audience he had spent his entire life trying to impress. The fear of public poverty gnawed savagely at his stomach. He was terrified of the impending moment when the venue staff would march into the room, cut the classical music, and demand the wealthy guests vacate the premises due to non-payment. He imagined the harsh whispers, the immediate scandal, the absolute societal ruin. Tyler's vision began to blur slightly at the edges. His lungs felt far too small to draw in enough oxygen. He was experiencing a severe physiological panic attack, while desperately trying to maintain the casual posture of a relaxed billionaire heir. Across the long table, Vanessa's parents were completely ignoring Tyler's rapid physical deterioration. They were entirely focused on their own desperate performance. Vanessa's mother held a crystal flute delicately between her fingers, waving it gracefully as she spoke to a captive audience of local politicians and corporate executives. She projected her voice so that it carried easily over the soft music playing in the background. She boasted loudly and incessantly about the upcoming merger of their historic aristocratic lineage with the vast commercial logistics empire supposedly controlled by her future son-in-law. She painted a vivid picture of generational wealth combining into an unstoppable financial dynasty. She bragged to anyone who would listen about future summer homes in Europe and joint corporate ventures that would dominate the regional markets. But while the mother blindly sold the dream to the room, Vanessa's father was playing a very different game. He sat quietly beside his wife, sipping his expensive whiskey with cold, calculated precision. His eyes never left Tyler. The older man watched the sweat rolling down Tyler's pale temples. He noticed the trembling hands pouring the champagne. He clearly remembered the desperate, pleading phone call he had secretly overheard in the penthouse hallway just a few hours ago. He knew Tyler had frantically attempted to mortgage his father's commercial properties to an illegal underground loan shark. The father's gaze was sharp and predatory. He watched Tyler like a hungry wolf studying a wounded, faltering deer. He was waiting for the perfect moment to confront the boy, to pull him aside and demand the absolute truth about the supposedly limitless wealth that was currently failing to manifest. The dynamic at the head table was deeply sickening. It was a group of desperate con artists circling each other, each frantically trying to maintain their own illusion while waiting for the other to break under the pressure. Tyler looked at the beautiful crystal centerpieces catching the chandelier light and realized that his entire life was just as fragile and transparent. He had never built anything of his own. He had never earned a single dollar through honest, grueling labor. He had merely existed as a parasite feeding off the vast resources of a man he fundamentally despised and entirely took for granted. Now the powerful host body had forcibly and permanently rejected him. The isolation Tyler felt was absolute. He had alienated and plotted against the only person in the world who had ever truly protected him. The reality of his impending destruction was so immense that he felt physically nauseated. He wanted to drop the champagne bottle and run. He wanted to sprint out of the grand ballroom, flee the coastal estate, and disappear into the dark night before the midnight deadline finally arrived. But his legs refused to move. He was completely paralyzed by the very social expectations he had worshipped his entire life. The string quartet in the corner of the room suddenly transitioned into a lively, upbeat piece signaling the beginning of the evening's formal toasts. The guests began to tap their silver spoons against their crystal glasses, a ringing chorus calling for the groom to speak. Tyler felt his stomach drop violently. He placed the heavy champagne bottle heavily on the table. He gripped the edge of the fine linen tablecloth to steady his shaking knees. He picked up his own glass and turned slowly to face the room. Hundreds of expectant, wealthy eyes locked onto him. They were waiting for a charismatic display of power and confidence. Tyler opened his mouth desperately, searching his terrified mind for the practiced, arrogant words that usually flowed so easily from his lips. His throat was entirely dry. No sound came out. At that precise moment, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted violently. It was not a gradual change, but a sudden, dramatic drop in the room's energy. The lively music of the string quartet faltered as the lead cellist seemingly lost his place in the sheet music. The cheerful, arrogant chatter of the wealthy guests began to die away, starting at the back of the hall and rolling forward like a heavy wave of sudden silence. Every head in the room slowly turned away from the trembling groom and looked toward the grand entrance. The heavy, solid mahogany doors at the very back of the ballroom had been unlatched. They swung open slowly, the massive brass hinges gliding silently. A lone figure stepped across the threshold and into the brilliant, blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. Tyler's breath hitched painfully in his chest. The delicate crystal flute slipped from his trembling, numb fingers. It hit the polished marble floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp sound of the breaking glass was brutally loud in the suddenly dead, silent room. It was Howard. He did not look like a frail, confused old man clinging to the fading edges of his memory. He did not look like a heavily medicated patient, destined for a miserable state-run psychiatric facility. He was dressed in an immaculate, commanding dark charcoal-tailored suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders. The heavy fabric seemed to absorb the light of the room, making him look like a solid pillar of storm clouds. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his posture was completely rigid and unyielding. The man who had spent 30 years building an empire from raw earth and poured concrete had arrived to reclaim his territory. Howard stepped fully into the room, his leather dress shoes echoing with heavy, deliberate footsteps against the marble floor. He stood perfectly still just inside the doorway. His sharp, calculating eyes swept over the lavish floral arrangements, over the suddenly terrified faces of Vanessa's parents, and finally locked entirely onto the pale, sweating face of his only son. The false narrative Tyler had spent months carefully constructing about his father's rapid mental decline disintegrated into fine dust in a fraction of a second. There was no dementia. There was no weakness. There was only a furious architect standing at the gates, ready to personally detonate the charges and bring the entire fraudulent structure crashing down. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me with a solid thud that echoed through the cavernous space. I stood at the threshold of the grand ballroom, letting the sheer absurdity of the scene wash over me. The room was a temple dedicated to excess. Thousands of crystal teardrops hung from the ceiling, casting a fractured golden light across tables, drowning in imported white orchids. Waiters in pristine white coats hovered like ghosts, carrying silver trays of caviar and champagne. And there, at the center of it all, was my son Tyler, standing perfectly still behind the head table, his face drained of all color. I did not rush. I walked forward with deliberate, measured steps. My leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. I wore a dark, tailored charcoal suit that fit me perfectly, a stark contrast to the flamboyant, colorful excess of the guests surrounding me. I did not look like a frail dementia patient who had wandered away from a state-run facility. I looked exactly like what I was, a man who had built a vast empire from nothing, coming to reclaim his territory. The shift in the room's energy was instantaneous and violent. The vibrant chatter of the wealthy elite began to falter, starting at the back of the hall and rippling forward like a wave of cold water. People turned in their chairs, their expensive jewelry catching the light as they craned their necks to look at me. The lead cellist of the string quartet noticed the sudden shift in the crowd. His bow scraped awkwardly across the strings, producing a discordant screech before the ambient music sputtered and died completely. Within seconds, a profound and suffocating silence settled over the entire ballroom. The only sound left was the distant rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the cliffs outside. As I moved down the long center aisle, I kept my eyes locked entirely on Tyler. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. His skin had turned a sickly ashen gray. The crystal champagne flute he had been holding slipped from his trembling, numb fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces. The sharp sound of the breaking glass was brutally loud in the dead, silent room. Tyler tried to open his mouth to speak, but his jaw merely trembled. He was completely paralyzed, stripped of all his arrogant bravado, trapped under the crushing weight of reality. The illusion he had spent months crafting was evaporating right before his eyes. Beside him, Vanessa's parents sat frozen in their seats. The father clutched his glass of whiskey so tightly his knuckles were white. He had overheard the desperate phone call in the hallway earlier, and now seeing me standing there perfectly lucid and commanding, he knew the final nail had been driven into their fraudulent coffin. Vanessa, however, was entirely oblivious to the impending destruction. She still fully believed the sinister narrative Tyler had spun for her. She believed I was a broken, mindless burden whose wealth was destined to become hers. Seeing me standing in the center aisle disrupting her flawless high society aesthetic ignited a furious, entitled rage inside her. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. She smoothed down her elaborate designer gown and pointed a manicured finger directly at me. Her voice rang out shrill and echoing in the silent ballroom. She demanded to know who had allowed this disheveled old man inside her exclusive private event. She turned furiously to a group of paralyzed waiters and ordered them to call security immediately. She yelled that I was clearly a sick, confused patient who had escaped from a care facility and that I was ruining the most important evening of her life. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the quiet air. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering behind their hands. Tyler looked at Vanessa with wide, terrified eyes, desperately, silently pleading with her to stop talking, but the damage was already done. I stopped walking. I was standing only a few feet away from the head table, directly facing my son and his bride. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you spend decades commanding construction sites and negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, you learn how to project your voice with an authority that forces people to listen. I looked at Vanessa with a cold, unyielding gaze. I told her that there would be no security called tonight, because I owned the very ground she was currently standing on. I informed her that I was neither confused nor sick. I told her the only sickness in this room was the parasitic greed she and her future husband were trying to disguise as love. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but the absolute certainty in my voice silenced her. I turned my attention away from her and addressed the entire room. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single word reached the farthest corners of the grand hall. I told the gathered crowd exactly what the Blake family name meant. I explained that the wealth funding this extravagant circus was not inherited money. It was not born from trust funds or idle aristocratic privilege. I told them about the decades of breathing in concrete dust, waking up before the sun, and shaking hands with foremen on frozen winter mornings. I described the immense crushing pressure of risking everything I owned on a single contract, knowing that hundreds of workers relied on my competence to feed their families. I had traded my youth, my sweat, and my peace of mind to build a foundation of absolute stability. Real labor created this empire. Real sacrifice built the walls that currently surrounded them. Then I pointed directly at Tyler. He flinched as if I had struck him. I told the silent crowd that the man standing before them, claiming to be the sole heir and operator of my logistics empire, had never worked a genuine day in his entire life. I exposed his grand lie without an ounce of mercy. I explained that Tyler had used my name and my hard-earned capital to construct a pathetic, hollow facade. He had paraded around the city, pretending to be a self-made titan, while secretly relying on me to bail out every single one of his failures. He was using the legacy of my honest labor to defraud everyone in this room, selling them the illusion of deep generational wealth that he had absolutely no legal right to touch. Tyler lowered his head, unable to meet the eyes of the wealthy peers he had tried so desperately to impress. He was shrinking before my eyes, reduced to nothing but the frightened 12-year-old boy who used to hide disciplinary letters under his bed. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The final mechanism of the trap was ready to be deployed. I pulled out the crisp, heavily folded documents I had secured earlier in the evening. I stepped forward and slammed them down squarely onto the pristine white linen tablecloth right next to Vanessa's empty plate. The first document was the forged medical power of attorney. I announced to the room that my son and his bride had conspired to have me committed to a substandard psychiatric facility against my will intending to strip me of my human rights to steal my companies. I told them I had intercepted their fraudulent legal documents and that my corporate attorneys were currently filing severe criminal charges against them, both for conspiracy and fraud. Vanessa collapsed back into her chair, covering her mouth with her hands. Her mother let out a quiet, terrified sob. Then I separated the second document from the pile and pushed it forward so everyone at the head table could see it clearly. It was the massive venue invoice from the Ocean View Pavilion. The bold numbers at the bottom of the page demanded $290,000. I looked past the head table toward the back wall where the venue director was standing frozen in shock. I addressed him directly. I told him loudly and clearly so that every single guest and staff member understood the absolute finality of the situation. I informed him that the corporate financial guarantee that had originally secured this event was permanently revoked. I stated that I had not authorized a single dime of my money to pay for this fraudulent celebration. I turned my gaze back to Tyler, who was now visibly trembling, weeping silent tears of absolute ruin. I told the venue director and the crowd that the Blake Empire owed them nothing. I pointed to the groom and announced that if the venue expected to be paid for the caviar, the champagne, and the exotic flowers they needed to collect their money directly from him immediately. I promised them they would find his pockets completely empty. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and totally devoid of hope. The lavish dinner had instantly transformed into a crime scene, and the perpetrators were finally trapped in the blinding light of the truth. The echo of my final declaration hung in the air for only a fraction of a second before the vacuum was filled with an explosive and deafening uproar. The grand ballroom, previously a sanctuary of hushed, polite, aristocratic chatter, violently erupted into absolute chaos. Guests at the surrounding tables leaped to their feet, their heavy wooden chairs scraping harshly against the polished marble floor. The polite whispers instantly morphed into frantic, scandalized shouting. The elite members of the city's high society, who just moments ago were sipping imported champagne and toasting to the new couple, were now eagerly pulling out their mobile devices. They began recording the spectacular downfall of the Blake family, hungry for every pathetic detail of the unfolding disaster. At the head table, Vanessa stared down at the documents resting on the pristine white linen. She reached out with trembling, manicured fingers and snatched the forged power of attorney from the table. Her eyes darted frantically across the complex legal jargon, desperately searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything to prove that her golden ticket had not just evaporated. But the truth was printed in undeniable black ink. The absolute control of my multi-million-dollar empire that Tyler had promised her was a complete and total fabrication. She turned toward Tyler, her face contorting into a mask of pure white-hot rage. The elegant, poised bride vanished entirely. She screamed at him, her voice cracking under the immense strain of her fury. She demanded an immediate explanation, violently waving the forged papers in his face. She demanded to know where the money was screaming at him, to fix the situation before they were completely ruined. Tyler could not even formulate a coherent sentence. He backed away from her, his hands raised defensively in a pathetic attempt to ward off her verbal assault. He opened his mouth, but only a shallow, breathless gasp escaped his lips. The polished, arrogant air was entirely gone. His bespoke tuxedo was soaked with nervous sweat, and his complexion had turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He realized with paralyzing clarity that he could not lie his way out of this room. There were no checks left for me to write, and no shadows left for him to hide within. The walls of the cavernous ballroom were rapidly closing in on him. Tyler looked at the furious, mocking faces of the wealthy guests he had spent years trying to impress. Unable to withstand the crushing, suffocating pressure of his total public exposure, Tyler's knees simply gave out. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor directly in front of Vanessa's father. The older man looked down at his future son-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He tried to pull his leg away, but Tyler lunged forward and grabbed the edge of the older man's tailored suit jacket. He wept openly and loudly, completely abandoning every last shred of his remaining dignity. He begged his future father-in-law to cover the $290,000 venue invoice. Tyler pleaded for a temporary bridge loan, swearing frantically that it was all a terrible administrative misunderstanding. He promised between pathetic sobs to repay every single cent by Monday morning, with exorbitant interest. He cried out that they could not let the lavish event be cancelled, that the public humiliation would destroy their combined social standing forever. He clutched at the man's legs, begging him to open his checkbook, wire the funds, and save the wedding from immediate termination. I stood silently and watched my only son grovel on the floor, weeping for a financial rescue from a man who was just as deeply fraudulent as he was. I felt no joy in witnessing his absolute destruction. There was no triumphant satisfaction, only the cold, necessary execution of justice. I stepped forward, closing the final distance between myself and the head table. I reached inside the inner pocket of my charcoal suit jacket one final time and withdrew the thick, heavy dossier compiled by my private investigator. I raised it high so the entire room could see it, and then I dropped the bound file onto the center of the table with a resounding, heavy thud. It landed right next to the extravagant floral centerpiece, violently disrupting the perfect aesthetic of the evening. I addressed Tyler, my voice easily cutting through his pathetic, continuous sobbing. I told him he was desperately begging for salvation from a dry well. I then shifted my gaze and looked directly at Vanessa's parents. Their haughty, aristocratic masks crumbled instantly under my intense scrutiny. I turned to face the hundreds of captivated guests and announced in a clear, booming voice that the elite, sophisticated family my son was desperately trying to marry into was entirely bankrupt. I did not hold back a single devastating detail. I spoke with absolute clarity, ensuring that every guest in the grand ballroom heard the undeniable, documented truth. I revealed that Vanessa's sprawling ancestral estate was currently facing its third and final notice of foreclosure. I detailed how the luxury European vehicles parked at the valet stand outside were heavily leased and critically behind on their monthly payments. I explained that the mother's accounts at the exclusive designer boutiques were frozen due to severe delinquency, and the father owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to private aggressive collection agencies. I exposed that their entire elevated social standing was nothing more than a hollow, desperate facade constructed on toxic debt and completely maxed out credit lines. Loud, unrestrained gasps echoed from the crowd as the illusion of high society shattered into a million jagged pieces. I looked down at my son, who was still kneeling on the marble floor, staring up at me with wide, uncomprehending eyes. I carefully explained the grotesque absurdity of their entire relationship. Tyler had completely fabricated his standing in my logistics company, manipulating documents and lying to convince Vanessa and her bankrupt parents that he was the sole uncontested owner of my empire. In return, Vanessa and her family had aggressively sold him the flawless illusion of deep generational aristocratic wealth. The mutual deception was violently laid bare for the world to see. Both families realized simultaneously that they had been actively attempting to scam each other, utilizing my hard-earned wealth as the ultimate non-existent prize. They were two drowning frauds who had blindly clung to each other in the dark, both fully believing the other was a solid golden lifeboat. I told the room that this grand, extravagant wedding was never a celebration of genuine love. It was a desperate, high-stakes corporate merger built entirely on absolute lies. They had maliciously planned to use the marriage certificate along with the forged medical documents to secure a massive payout from my estate to save themselves from their own imminent financial ruin. But the truth was finally out in the open, and there was absolutely no money left to steal. Vanessa's father slumped backward into his chair, covering his face with his trembling hands as the brutal reality of his public exposure set in. He knew his creditors would be calling by dawn, armed with the knowledge of his total ruin. Vanessa stood frozen behind the table, the forged power of attorney finally slipping from her numb fingers and fluttering uselessly to the floor. She stared blankly at Tyler, realizing that she had permanently tied her fate to a man who was just as destitute and powerless as she was. Their grand, sinister scheme to rob a hard-working father had failed spectacularly. The entire chandelier-lit room stood as a massive, expensive monument to their mutual deception, and the massive bill was finally due. The coastal venue manager had heard enough. He stepped out from the shadows at the back of the room, flanked by 6 imposing private security guards, dressed in dark tactical suits. His face was a mask of cold, uncompromising fury. He marched directly down the center aisle toward the head table, completely ignoring the whimpering groom still curled on the floor. He picked up the unpaid, staggering invoice from the tablecloth. He turned to the massive crowd and raised his voice, demanding absolute silence and immediate attention. The manager declared loudly that due to egregious non-payment and verifiable documented financial fraud, the exclusive contract for the Ocean View Pavilion was officially and permanently canceled. He gestured sharply to the perimeter of the room. The ballroom's main maintenance lights were instantly switched on, flooding the romantic, dimly lit space with harsh, unforgiving white light. He ordered the string quartet to pack their instruments and cease playing immediately. He instructed the massive team of waitstaff to stop serving the imported food and begin clearing the fine china from the tables, regardless of whether the guests had finished eating. Then the manager looked out at the hundreds of wealthy, stunned guests sitting in shocked silence. He explicitly informed them that the private event was officially over. He demanded that all attendees, including the bridal party, vacate the premises immediately, warning that local law enforcement would be called to escort trespassers from the property. The private security guards stepped forward, forming a physical barricade and gesturing toward the exit doors. What was supposed to be the most luxurious wedding celebration of the decade had officially been transformed into a chaotic, humiliating mass eviction. The grand ballroom, once a temple of fake aristocracy, rapidly transformed into a theater of utter humiliation. The wealthy elite who had spent the evening sipping stolen champagne now scrambled toward the exit doors like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The rustle of expensive silk gowns and the frantic clicking of polished leather shoes against the marble floor created a chaotic symphony of retreat. No one wanted to be associated with the spectacular downfall of the Blake family. They averted their eyes, whispering furiously to one another as they squeezed past the venue security guards. Within minutes, the cavernous hall was stripped of its audience, leaving behind a wasteland of abandoned crystal glasses and dying white orchids. Tyler remained on the floor, surrounded by the glittering shards of his shattered champagne flute. The velvet smoking jacket he wore, meant to project the effortless power of a billionaire heir, was now soaked with the cold sweat of absolute terror. He looked wildly across the room toward Vanessa and her parents. He was silently begging them to intervene, to use their supposed generational wealth to halt the venue manager and reverse the eviction. Instead, Vanessa simply turned her back to him. Her parents were already shrinking into the shadows, terrified that their own imminent bankruptcy and mutual deception would draw the attention of the authorities. Tyler was entirely, profoundly alone. The reality of his isolation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. Tyler turned his panicked gaze back to me. He did not stand up to face me like a man. He dropped heavily onto his hands and knees. The slick marble floor offered no traction as he dragged his body forward, crawling through the spilled champagne and broken glass. He reached out with trembling, desperate hands and clamped his fingers around the fabric of my tailored trousers. He wept with a loud, guttural sound, burying his face against my legs. He begged for financial salvation. He used the word family over and over again, wielding it like a blunt weapon. He cried out that I was his father, that we shared the same blood, and that a father could not simply abandon his only son to societal ruin. He promised that he would change, that he would work in the warehouse, that he would do anything I asked, if I would only write a check to the venue manager and make the nightmare end. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping shell of a man I had raised. For 30 years, the sight of his tears would have compelled me to reach for my checkbook. I would have moved heaven and earth to shield him from discomfort. But the man looking down at him tonight possessed a heart forged from cold iron. I did not feel pity. I felt the absolute unyielding clarity of a surgeon preparing to excise a terminal tumor. I took a deliberate, measured step backward. The sudden movement forced his grasping hands to fall away from my suit. Tyler collapsed forward onto the marble, gasping for air. I reached up and meticulously adjusted the lapels of my jacket, a quiet physical gesture that severed the emotional cord between us forever. I spoke to him in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. I told him never to use the word family in my presence again. A real family, I explained, is built on a foundation of mutual respect and unbreakable loyalty. A real family does not forge signatures on complex legal documents to steal a lifetime of honest labor. A son who loves his father does not scour the darkest corners of the city to find corrupt medical examiners. A loving son does not orchestrate a sinister plot to declare his father mentally incompetent, intending to lock him in a state-run psychiatric facility just to gain uncontested access to his bank accounts. I raised my voice slightly, ensuring the words echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. I told him that a real family does not mortgage commercial warehouses to underground loan sharks to fund a fraudulent aristocratic illusion. Tyler whimpered against the floor, shaking his head in a pathetic attempt to deny the irrefutable truth. I looked down at him and reached into my memory, pulling out a specific detail from the very beginning of this grotesque wedding planning process. I reminded him of the morning he had stormed into my office, demanding that I cover the exorbitant cost of this coastal venue. I had refused to pay the full amount, transferring only a fraction of the cost, and I had attached a handwritten note to the wire transfer receipt. I recited the words of that note slowly. "Be thankful I let you contribute." Tyler had mocked that note at the time. He had laughed at my attempt to instill a sense of financial responsibility. Now I told him the true meaning behind those words. For his entire life, I had contributed money, luxury vehicles, downtown penthouses, and endless bailouts. I had given him everything except the one thing he desperately needed to become a functioning human being. I looked at the venue manager and the security guards standing nearby, and then I looked back at my son. I declared that tonight I was finally contributing the ultimate necessary gift. I was giving him inescapable accountability. I told him that true love sometimes requires allowing a structure to burn to the ground so that something stronger might eventually be built from the ashes. I informed him that my role as his financial shield was permanently terminated. He was finally going to face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of the life he had chosen to lead. The heavy silence of the ballroom absorbed my final declaration. The terrible weight of the word accountability seemed to press Tyler completely flat against the stone floor. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the void of his own making. Then a new sound pierced the quiet night air. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail echoing off the rocky coastal cliffs outside. Within seconds, the sound amplified into a deafening, terrifying roar. The piercing shriek of multiple police sirens cut through the suffocating atmosphere of the estate. Bright flashes of red and blue light sliced through the tall glass windows, painting the panicked faces of Vanessa and her parents in alternating frantic colors of alarm. The heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung wide open once more. A large squad of uniformed police officers marched into the grand hall, their duty belts rattling sharply with every determined step. They bypassed the lingering venue staff entirely and headed straight for the center of the room. My investigator, Gideon Cross, had executed his final directive with flawless surgical precision. He had delivered the comprehensive dossier of irrefutable evidence directly to the authorities. The police possessed the recorded phone calls to the loan sharks, the documented attempts at bank fraud, the forged medical directives, and the clear evidence of grand larceny from his midnight intrusion. The officers formed a tight, inescapable circle around Tyler. They commanded him to stand up and place his hands behind his back. The trap had permanently closed, the illusion was completely dead, and the era of endless bailouts was officially over. The heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots against the polished marble floor shattered whatever fragile illusion remained in the grand ballroom. A squad of uniformed police officers moved with calculated, terrifying efficiency through the sea of abandoned dining tables and dying white orchids. The stark contrast between their dark utilitarian tactical uniforms and the extravagant, suffocating opulence of the room created a jarring visual dissonance. Static crackled sharply from their shoulder-mounted radios, cutting through the heavy silence of the shocked venue staff. This was no longer a celebration of aristocratic wealth. It was an active crime scene. The officers did not hesitate or offer polite apologies as they navigated the debris of shattered crystal and overturned chairs. They marched directly toward the head table, their eyes locked entirely on the pathetic, weeping figure still kneeling on the floor. Tyler was trembling so violently that the expensive dark fabric of his bespoke tuxedo seemed to vibrate under the bright chandelier lights. He stared up at the approaching officers with wide, uncomprehending eyes, his mind entirely unable to process the severe reality crashing down upon him. He had spent his entire life insulated by my money, completely shielded from the harsh consequences of his own arrogance. Now the very authorities my private investigator Gideon Cross had summoned were forming an impenetrable physical wall around him. The lead officer stepped forward, his voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that demanded absolute compliance. He ordered Tyler to stand up and place his hands behind his back. Tyler did not move. He was completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing as he gasped for air in the suffocating atmosphere of his own ruined lies. Two officers reached down, gripping him firmly by the shoulders, and hauled him to his feet with rough, unyielding force. Tyler let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper as they twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed loudly across the cavernous space. It was the sound of absolute finality. The lead officer began to read Tyler his rights, reciting the cold, methodical legal phrases that officially stripped away his freedom. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words bounced off the high vaulted ceilings and the glittering crystal chandeliers, creating a grim echo. Tyler swayed heavily on his feet, his knees buckling under the immense crushing weight of public humiliation. He looked wildly around the room, searching for a sympathetic face, but the venue staff only watched him with expressions of profound disgust and morbid fascination. The billionaire prince had been instantly reduced to a common, desperate criminal caught in the act of severe financial fraud. The sheer magnitude of the deception finally penetrated Vanessa's mind. She stood frozen behind the head table, staring at the handcuffed man who had promised her an empire. The realization that she had tethered her future to a penniless fraud ignited a raw volcanic fury deep within her chest. The poised, elegant bride entirely evaporated, replaced instantly by a feral cornered animal. She let out a piercing, venomous scream that startled the officers holding Tyler. She lunged forward, slamming her hands against the linen tablecloth, overturning a massive silver candelabra. She demanded to know how he could have been so incredibly stupid, screaming that he had ruined her life and destroyed her flawless social standing. Tyler flinched away from her, sobbing incoherently, but Vanessa was completely relentless. She berated him with ruthless, vicious precision, entirely oblivious to the irony that she had been attempting the exact same scam. She shrieked about the cost of her custom designer gown and the profound embarrassment she would now face among her elite social circles. In a sudden, violent motion, she grabbed her left hand and viciously twisted the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She hurled the heavy piece of jewelry directly at Tyler with all her strength. The ring struck him squarely in the chest before bouncing off the marble floor and rolling away into the dark shadows beneath the tables. She screamed that she never wanted to see his pathetic face again, cursing the very moment she had ever believed his ridiculous, hollow lies. While Vanessa unleashed her humiliated rage, her parents were quietly executing their own desperate survival strategy. They had watched the police officers enter the ballroom with absolute, paralyzing dread. The father knew precisely what this meant. If my investigators had uncovered Tyler's extensive fraud, they had undoubtedly exposed his own catastrophic financial ruin. The heavy, suffocating reality, imminent bankruptcy pressed down heavily on his shoulders. He knew that by dawn the ruthless collection agencies and aggressive creditors would be hunting him down armed with the undeniable proof of his total insolvency. He grabbed his wife by the arm, his grip bruising and frantic. They did not attempt to comfort their screaming daughter. They did not offer a single word of defense or explanation. Instead, they shrank into the shadows of the grand hall, moving with the pathetic, scurrying urgency of frightened rodents. They slipped quietly toward a discreet side exit, intended for the catering staff pushing past a bewildered waiter. They abandoned their daughter, abandoned their grand illusion of high society, and fled into the cold coastal night, desperate to escape the inevitable crushing avalanche of their own unpaid debts. The officers began to march Tyler toward the main doors, their grips tight and unforgiving on his arms. His designer shoes dragged helplessly against the polished marble, leaving scuff marks on the pristine surface. As they pulled him past the massive abandoned dining tables, Tyler twisted his neck to look back at me one final time. His tear-streaked face was a portrait of pure, desperate pleading. I knew exactly what that look meant, because I had seen it 1,000 times before. I had seen it when he crashed his first luxury car at 17 and expected me to buy him a new one. I had seen it when he failed out of his elite university and expected me to bribe his way back in. I had seen it every single time he squandered thousands of dollars on reckless, arrogant ventures and expected me to cover the massive losses. He was looking for the familiar, comfortable safety net to deploy. He fully expected me to step forward, speak quietly to the officers, write a massive check, and miraculously wave the severe legal consequences away. He expected the endless, unconditional bailout that had defined our entire deeply flawed relationship. But I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid and my expression carved from unyielding stone. I looked directly into his terrified, pleading eyes and offered absolutely nothing. The long, destructive era of blind parental enabling was permanently finished. I remembered the handwritten note I had attached to the initial venue deposit, warning him to be thankful I let him contribute. Tonight, I was finally contributing the ultimate necessary gift. I was giving him inescapable, absolute accountability. The agonizing realization finally washed over his face. He saw that the man standing before him was no longer a forgiving father, willing to sweep away the debris of his catastrophic failures. He saw a resolute, immovable force of justice who had definitively stopped financing his toxic destruction. He let out a final broken wail as the officers hauled him through the heavy mahogany doors, dragging him out of the brilliant light and into the unforgiving reality of the criminal justice system. Outside the venue, the harsh red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the thick coastal fog in violent, frantic strokes. The officers shoved Tyler into the cramped, sterile back seat of a patrol car. The heavy door slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud, locking him inside a cold steel cage built entirely by his own unchecked greed. Back inside the grand ballroom, the venue manager stood near the main electrical panel. He looked over the abandoned, ruined remnants of the lavish celebration with a sharp, disgusted sigh. He reached up and pulled the massive, heavy breaker switch. The thousands of glittering crystal teardrops instantly went dark. The extravagant chandeliers powered down, and the entire cavernous hall was abruptly plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The magnificent, glittering dream of limitless aristocratic wealth had been forcefully and permanently converted into a cold, sterile legal nightmare, leaving only the faint, rhythmic sound of the dark ocean crashing against the rocks outside. A full 7 days had passed since the lavish illusion shattered on the marble floor of the coastal estate. The passage of a single week is usually an unremarkable metric of time, but in the ruthless circles of the city financial elite, it was more than enough time to completely dismantle 2 prominent dynasties. The scandal had ignited immediately, spreading like a wild brush fire through the exclusive country clubs and private boardroom meetings. It was the only topic of conversation among the wealthy peers who had witnessed the spectacular implosion of the rehearsal dinner. The whispered rumors transformed rapidly into documented facts printed boldly on the front pages of the local business journals. The dramatic eviction and the subsequent arrest of the groom provided endless entertainment for a society that fed on the downfall of its own members. The aristocratic facade constructed by Vanessa's family evaporated with astonishing speed. The morning after the canceled dinner, their aggressive creditors descended upon them with absolute merciless precision. The private collection agencies no longer bothered with polite phone calls or discreet warnings. They arrived at the sprawling ancestral estate with heavy tow trucks and armed repossession agents. The luxury European vehicles parked in the circular driveway were seized before noon. The banks officially initiated highly publicized foreclosure proceedings on the property, ensuring that the entire city knew the extent of their severe delinquency. Vanessa's parents were forcibly stripped of their unearned status and thrown into a humiliating public bankruptcy. They were left with absolutely nothing but the toxic, crushing weight of their unpaid debts and the profound shame of their exposed lies. Vanessa herself became a social pariah. The exclusive circles she had dominated for years instantly closed their doors to her. Her meticulously curated image as a wealthy, sophisticated bride was permanently replaced by the pathetic reality of a desperate woman who had foolishly tied her fate to a bankrupt fraud. She was forced to abandon her expensive boutique shopping habits and face a bleak future devoid of the unearned luxury she felt she inherently deserved. The grand high society life she had violently demanded from my son was officially dead. Meanwhile, Tyler was currently experiencing a completely different kind of ruin. The spoiled billionaire heir who had never spent a single night outside the comfort of a luxury penthouse was now sitting in a sterile concrete cell at the county detention center. He was facing multiple severe felony charges for attempted bank fraud and the deliberate forgery of medical and legal documents. The pristine, bespoke tuxedo had been confiscated and replaced with a harsh, scratchy orange uniform that offered absolutely no protection from the biting cold of the jail block. The heavy steel bars of his cell were a brutal, uncompromising reminder of his new reality. Tyler had spent the first 48 hours crying uncontrollably, fully expecting my high-priced corporate attorneys to sweep into the precinct and arrange his immediate release. He waited eagerly for the familiar safety net to catch him just as it always had. He assumed I would eventually calm down, pay his exorbitant bail, and smooth over the criminal charges with a massive influx of cash. But the days dragged on with agonizing slowness, and the heavy metal doors remained securely locked. He was finally forced to understand that there would be no magical rescue. He was functionally destitute and entirely incapable of hiring a private defense lawyer. He was assigned a notoriously overworked public defender who had absolutely no interest in coddling a wealthy fraud. For the very first time in his pampered existence, Tyler was entirely at the mercy of a justice system that did not care about his last name. While my son sat shivering in a county jail, I sat quietly in the warm, sunlit sanctuary of my private study. The shattered glass and overturned furniture from his midnight intrusion had been completely cleared away. The antique mahogany desk was restored to its flawless condition. Across from me sat my private investigator, Gideon Cross. He held a thick leather portfolio containing the final legal documents required to completely sever my financial ties to Tyler. Gideon placed the crisp papers on the desk with a quiet, respectful nod. I picked up my favorite gold fountain pen and signed my name on the bottom line of every single page. I officially and permanently dissolved the massive trust accounts that had previously guaranteed Tyler's luxurious lifestyle. I legally redirected every single dollar of my vast estate toward reputable charitable organizations dedicated to elder care and medical research. The immense fortune I had built through decades of grueling, honest labor would never be touched by the greedy, grasping hands of my treacherous son. The ink dried quickly on the heavy paper, securing my legacy and terminating his unearned privilege. As I handed the finalized portfolio back to Gideon, a profound and unshakable sense of clarity washed over me. For 30 years, I had carried the suffocating, exhausting weight of trying to protect a son who fundamentally despised me. I had lived in a constant state of anxiety, constantly repairing the collateral damage of his arrogant mistakes. I had convinced myself that my endless financial sacrifices were an expression of parental love. Now I understood that I had merely been feeding a parasite that was slowly destroying my peace of mind. The surgical removal of that toxicity brought an absolute beautiful silence to my life. The emotional burden I had shouldered for decades simply vanished. I felt no lingering sorrow. I felt no agonizing guilt or parental regret. I only felt the clean, sharp satisfaction of a man who had finally excised a terminal illness from his body. I breathed in the quiet air of my study and realized that the final years of my life were now entirely my own. I was free to live exactly as I chose without the constant looming threat of betrayal and theft hanging over my head. Gideon packed away the documents, shook my hand firmly, and quietly let himself out of the estate. I remained in the study pouring myself a small glass of aged bourbon. I walked over to the large glass windows and looked out at the churning dark waters of the ocean below. The storm had passed, and the coastal sky was clear and bright. The profound silence of the room was suddenly broken by the sharp ringing of the telephone on my desk. I turned around and stared at the device. I knew exactly who was calling. I walked slowly across the Persian rug and picked up the heavy receiver. An automated mechanical voice echoed through the speaker, informing me that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the county detention center. The robotic voice prompted me to press a button to accept the charges. I pressed the button. The line clicked, and the frantic, weeping voice of my son poured into my ear. Tyler was sobbing so violently that he could barely articulate his words. He choked on his own tears, begging me to please listen to him. He pleaded for bail money, swearing that the county jail was a terrifying nightmare and that he could not survive another night locked in the concrete cell. He cried out that he was sorry for the forged documents and the cruel deception, promising to spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He used the word "dad" over and over again, wielding it as a desperate final weapon to break my resolve. I listened to his pathetic, humiliating pleas without a single trace of emotion. I let him cry until his voice cracked and faded into a desperate, trembling whimper. I stood perfectly still, holding the receiver calmly against my ear. I finally spoke, cutting through his tears with a voice of cold, absolute authority. I told him that the trust accounts were permanently dissolved and the bank accounts were completely closed. I informed him that the limitless safety net he had taken for granted, his entire life had been completely incinerated. I stated clearly that a real family does not forge signatures or plot false medical commitments to steal a lifetime of honest labor. I reminded him that he was 30 years old and that he had made a series of deliberate, malicious choices to defraud the only person who had ever truly protected him. Tyler let out a breathless, horrified gasp, realizing that his begging was completely futile. I told him that the time for running away from his mistakes was officially over. I explained that his actions now carried real-world adult consequences and that he was going to face the severe felony charges entirely on his own. I advised him to cooperate fully with his public defender and to prepare himself for a very long stay in the state penitentiary. He screamed my name, begging me not to hang up, but there was nothing left to say. The lesson was complete. I pulled the receiver away from my ear, severing the toxic tie forever. I placed the phone gently back onto its cradle, cutting off his desperate cries and restoring the perfect, beautiful silence to my home. I took a slow sip of my bourbon, looking out at the endless horizon, feeling nothing but absolute, unyielding peace. The ink on the final legal documents had long since dried. I sat alone in the quiet sanctuary of my private study, running my hands over the smooth surface of the heavy bonded paper. The vast financial empire that had taken me 30 years to build from nothing was no longer a ticking time bomb waiting to be squandered. It had been entirely repurposed and secured. I had legally established a new operational trust to manage the entirety of my wealth. The massive accounts that were once vaguely destined to fund downtown penthouses and luxury cars for an ungrateful child had been permanently redirected. Every single dollar was now meticulously structured to provide grants and direct funding for underprivileged youth who desperately wanted to learn honest trades. I demanded that my wealth build genuine futures, rather than fund hollow arrogance and endless entitlement. I pictured the young men and women who would eventually receive these substantial funds. They were people who truly knew the value of a dollar because they had to bleed and sweat for it. They understood the crushing weight of real-world responsibility. By purposefully tearing down the toxic inheritance I had originally built, I was laying the sturdy groundwork for hundreds of actual, sustainable lives. The money would buy steel tools, thick textbooks, and raw materials. It would pay for skilled instructors and practical education. It would never again be used to purchase a counterfeit aristocratic illusion or a fake velvet jacket. The burden of my monumental mistake had been completely lifted from my weary shoulders. I felt an incredible surge of vitality returning to my aging bones. 2 weeks after the ink dried, I decided to personally visit the very first project funded by the new charitable foundation. It was a massive vocational training center being erected on the dusty industrial edge of the city. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked directly onto the active work site. The intense sensory experience hit me like a physical wave of pure, unadulterated nostalgia. I closed my eyes and breathed in the sharp metallic scent of welding sparks mixing beautifully with the heavy, earthy aroma of freshly poured concrete. The morning air was thick with the familiar smell of rough-cut pine and swirling yellow sawdust. It was the exact same perfume that had clung to my clothes during the first 20 grueling years of my adult life. I walked among the towering steel beams and the fresh wooden framing, listening to the rhythmic pounding of heavy hammers and the loud echoing shouts of the foreman coordinating the daily labor. There was absolutely no pretense here. There were no imported orchids or elaborate crystal chandeliers hiding the ugly truth. There were only calloused hands, heavy leather work boots, and the undeniable, magnificent reality of physical creation. Standing amidst the thick dust and the deafening noise, I felt profoundly and deeply connected to my authentic roots. I remembered the exhausted young man I had once been, pouring foundations in the freezing rain, just to keep the lights on and feed my family. I had spent the last decade trapped in sterile boardrooms and suffocating high society galas, entirely disconnected from the raw grit that had originally defined my character. The sun I raised had tried to drag me even further into that artificial world, hoping to bury my honest legacy under thick layers of expensive fabric and borrowed prestige. But the parasite had been surgically removed. The infection of endless greed had been entirely cured. I stood on the raw earth of the construction site, completely free from the suffocating burden of deceit. I watched a young apprentice carefully measuring a wooden beam, his face twisted in deep concentration, and I felt a profound surge of genuine pride. This diligent boy would learn to build a beautiful life with his own 2 hands. He would never rely on forgery or emotional manipulation to survive. This vocational school was my true legacy. The following morning, I woke up long before the sun. I walked into my quiet kitchen and went through the familiar, comforting motions of my daily routine. I scooped the dark, roasted grounds into the paper filter and listened to the low, steady rumble of the coffee machine. I poured the steaming black liquid into a simple, heavy ceramic mug. I did not need the sprawling coastal estate or the army of silent staff to validate my existence. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped out onto the wide back porch. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the faint, salty mist of the nearby churning ocean. I sat down in my weathered wooden rocking chair and rested my hands around the warm ceramic mug. Slowly, the deep blue shadows of the night began to retreat across the lawn. A brilliant golden light crested over the distant watery horizon, painting the dark waves in vibrant strokes of amber and crimson. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter coffee, letting the delicious warmth spread slowly through my chest. The silence of my large home was no longer a heavy, oppressive blanket of loneliness or regret. It was a triumphant, roaring declaration of absolute peace. The sprawling house was completely empty, but my soul was finally full. I had successfully restored my personal dignity. I had fiercely protected the memory of my late wife and the pristine honor of my own hard labor. The agonizing, miserable chapter of blind parental enabling was permanently closed. I watched the bright golden sun climb higher into the morning sky, feeling the gentle soothing heat against my weathered face. I had proven to myself and to the world that true strength does not require shouting or desperate, pathetic displays of stolen wealth. The ultimate display of power is simply the quiet, unflinching execution of absolute justice. The ultimate lesson learned from this ordeal is that enabling destructive behavior disguised as parental love only breeds entitlement and severe resentment. True compassion sometimes requires stepping back and allowing individuals to face the severe consequences of their own malicious actions. Shielding someone from accountability prevents them from developing integrity and moral fortitude. Wealth and immense privilege cannot replace genuine character, and a foundation built on deceit will inevitably collapse under the heavy weight of reality. Accountability, no matter how deeply painful to administer, remains the only genuine catalyst for personal transformation and true justice. If you found this story compelling and thought-provoking, please share your perspective in the comments section and subscribe for more narratives exploring the complex dynamics of family betrayal and ultimate justice.